Bush strategy let the Europeans negotiate with the Iranians while the Americans make threatening noises, a policy that, it could well be argued, has so far proven 100% ineffective. Sir?
How right that is. Let's remember, by the way, that the nuclear program in Iran was started by the Shah. The Bushehr reactor, for example, was built by him in megalomaniac days, and if he'd been a little faster, he might have been able to hand over an entire fully finished nuclear program to Ayatollah Khomeini. Remember, any state that goes nuclear, in a sense, makes its successors and sometimes its enemies nuclear powers as well, runs that risk. So, there are differences, however, I think. One is, we had every reason to think if Saddam Hussein had a thermonuclear weapon, he'd have found an early occasion to use it.
Right.
Either use it or use it for blackmail.
Right.
I don't have that fear, actually, about the Iranians. There's no one they can go to war with. And incidentally, we've just done them the rather large favor of removing their two greatest enemies, the Taliban and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party.
Right.
They're not going to have a nuclear war with Israel, because they would lose it.
Yes.
And furthermore, nuclear weapons aren't usable even by the most fanatical Islamists in Palestine, because you'd have to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, as well as the Wailing Wall, and kill the Palestinians as well as the Jews, in other words. So the immediate danger isn't that terrifying. The problem is that one doesn't want to reward the cheating and concealment and theft and smuggling and black market acquisition, the open contempt for international law that's involved, but the regime might also give way in time to a successor regime that would be more internationalist and more democratic. That option was not going to occur naturally in Iraq, and it certainly isn't going to occur naturally in North Korea.
You've said that in North Korea, the Bush administration, the United States, ought to be pushing much harder on the humanitarian line.
Yes.
Now, my colleague at the Hoover Institution, Abbas Milani, himself an Iranian, who spent some time in the Shah's jails, points out or argues that the young people in Iran, and the population, well over half the population is 25 or younger, is immensely favorably disposed toward the United States. That what we ought to be doing is engaging in a kind of rhetorical comradeship with the democracy movement and waiting. That the principal job of the Bush administration is to show its friendship toward the young people of Iran and not mess it up. Do you agree?
I'm very much of your friend's opinion. I mean, I grew this beard on the advice of a graduate student of mine, an Iranian, who was my guide. He said, if you want to go to the Friday prayers and the Death to America events, you better look as scruffy as you can. So I did, and so did he, but and it seemed to work, but also it made life very difficult. Often taxis wouldn't stop for us because they thought we were Hezbollah. And relatives of his would say, you know, we went to dinner with them, can't you shave that off? You look like some Islamic Republic nightmare. You could get spat on. You know, it's the hatred for the regime among the young is a delightful thing to see, as is the friendship towards the United States. And I have a word for it.
Yes.
Well, it's the baby boomerang. You see, the mullahs threw away so many of their young people in a suicide wave war with Saddam Hussein, which people I think still remember. The throwing away of handfuls of the younger generation. You know, what turned into a pointless war. They had to give Iranian women incentives to
produce,
make up the deficit.
Right.
Now there is a baby boom, but it's a baby boomerang, because this younger generation despises the mullahs and the state that they run, wants to live in America, if it can't do that, wants to live an American life. The regime, meanwhile, is becoming visibly senile. It's not reproducing itself, palpably senile. And so even the Revolutionary Guards are getting a bit long in the tooth.
So you're quite confident?
Well, give it 10 years, and yes, it will metamorphose into something like a secular Middle Eastern democracy. But the timeline of Hezbollah and of the nukes isn't a 10-year timeline.
So Bush
it would be very. If you were the President of the United States, you said, I think let's just relax about Iran for about 10 years. I can see people saying, well, Mr. President, do you want it later to be said that you ignored the building of a secret tunnel in Isfahan for the concealment? It would be a tough call.
So Bush he needs to make his threatening noises, and he needs not to mess it up. He's doing all right.
There's no settled policy, though, in the administration.
I mean, in other words,
they're doing this not as a policy, because they're doing it because they haven't got a policy, not because they have. So I can't praise it.
But it's not doing too much harm.
It doesn't make me want to go and demonstrate, no.
Thank you very much. One last
the White House Gates test.
Final couple of questions. Describe the Arab world as you believe it will exist a decade from now. Alas, what I'm after here is the Wolfowitz vision, the Wolfowitz and Bush vision of democracy blossoming. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. Iraq will be a functioning democracy a decade from now?
There's every reason to think that it could be. Yes.
Lebanon?
In some ways, Lebanon already is a functioning democracy.
And will there be a Palestinian state?
Yes, there certainly will be a Palestinian state. There should have been one 2 decades ago. There will be one a decade from now.
But that's in prospect?
Yes.
Good. Happy to hear it. Describe the reputation of George W. Bush a decade from now. Last question.
I'm going to a debate in England in a few weeks, sponsored by The Economist, where I was asked to come and take the side of the motion that said, "Thank God for George Bush." And I wrote and said, since I'll be at the same festival saying there's no God to thank, could we not rephrase the motion? And I said, I would prefer to have it said that history will be kinder, much kinder, to Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair than to Herr Schroeder or Mr. Chirac or Mr. Kofi Annan. And I think if I phrase it like that, I've answered your question.